Quickly, help the king!
We must lift the horse! Pull, everyone, pull!
On a frozen morning of January the 24th, in the year 1536, in the tilt-yard of Greenwich Palace, a single, sickening sound sliced through the winter air, a sound of metal crushing bone, a sound that shattered the silence of power. It was the sound of death landing squarely on the English throne. A mountain of flesh encased in 60 pounds of engraved armor had fallen, and his warhorse, armored and massive, had come crashing down on top of him. In one instant, the grand spectacle of chivalry and monarchy became a scene of horror and disbelief. King Henry VIII, the man who defied the Pope, broke the church, and turned all of Europe on its head for the sake of one woman, now lay still in the mud and frost, breathless and broken, and for a few long, eternal moments, no one dared say what they all feared. The king was dead. In our timeline, he woke up 2 hours later, groggy, concussed, and forever changed. His survival unleashed a darker, more tyrannical phase of his reign, one that drowned England in fear, blood, and betrayal. But let us forget that history for a moment. Let us imagine a version where the damage was just slightly worse, where his skull fractured deeper, or his heart paused longer. Let us imagine a world where Henry VIII never woke up again. That single twist of fate would not just alter a dynasty, it would rewrite an entire century. No 6 wives, no Anne of Cleves, no Jane Seymour, no Elizabeth, no Spanish Armada. Just a frozen corpse beneath a warhorse, and an empire thrown into chaos. The moment the whispered truth passed from one trembling courtier to another that the king was gone, there were no tears. Only panic. England, a realm ruled solely by the iron will of one man, now had no roadmap. There was no official heir, no clear regency, no plan. Princess Elizabeth was only 2 years old, born of Anne Boleyn, whose legitimacy was hotly contested. Princess Mary, daughter of the banished Queen Catherine, was older, Catholic, and popular among the old nobility, but officially declared illegitimate by Parliament. The power vacuum was immediate, and while others hesitated, one man moved like a blade in the dark. Thomas Cromwell. Cromwell, the son of a blacksmith from Putney. He was no nobleman, but his mind was the sharpest weapon at court. He knew that his entire future, every reform, every ounce of power he had scraped together, hung by a single thread, and that thread was Anne Boleyn. If she fell, so would he. And so, in those breathless hours after the king's fall, Cromwell acted with terrifying speed. He locked the gates of London, rallied the city guard, seized the treasury, and occupied the Tower. With ruthless precision, he forced the Privy Council into an emergency agreement. A regency would be established, led by him, but only until the Queen gave birth to the child she carried. Because now, everything rested on that unborn child. But far to the north, another storm gathered. Thomas Howard, the Duke of Norfolk, Anne's uncle and a staunch Catholic, saw his chance. He despised Anne as a disgrace to the nobility, hated Cromwell as an upstart servant, and had an army at his back. With one command, he could march south and take the capital by force. The country now had not one but 2 centers of power, and England stood on the precipice of civil war. At the heart of this storm stood Anne Boleyn, a queen without a king, a woman carrying the future of a crumbling realm inside her. Secluded in her rooms, She was not idle. No longer the flirtatious seductress of court gossip, she became a strategist in silk. Secret meetings with Cromwell, Archbishop Cranmer, and loyal nobles were held by candlelight. Letters were dispatched in cipher. Favors were called in. Allies were warned. If her child was a boy, she would be mother to the king. If it was a girl, she might not live to see the next season. Her womb had become a battlefield, and time was the enemy. And then, spring arrived, and with it, the screams of labor echoed through Greenwich. For hours, the court waited in agonizing suspense. Outside the birthing chamber, noble paced. Messengers stood ready. The fate of England hung on the cry of a newborn. And then it came. A boy. A healthy, crying, living boy. In an instant, a proclamation was made. Henry IX had been born. The king was dead. But a new king lived. The news swept across the realm like a divine miracle. Norfolk, sensing the tides turning, galloped south and bent the knee to the queen and her infant son. The plot collapsed overnight. The child, this one fragile infant, had saved the Tudor dynasty, and Anne Boleyn, the woman who once faced a future beneath the executioner's axe, now wore the crown of the most powerful woman in Europe. As Queen Regent of England, she would rule not beside a man, but in her own right. The game had changed, and history had chosen a new path. No Jane Seymour, no Catherine Howard, no Anne of Cleves, no Catherine Parr, no monstrous king staggering into old age, surrounded by sycophants and corpses, no Elizabeth raised in terror and exile, no Gloriana, only a boy king, a queen regent, and a blacksmith's son pulling the strings of a kingdom reborn from the ashes of a frozen jousting field. This was not the end of a story. It was the beginning, and what followed next was far more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. The doors of Greenwich Palace closed before the sun had fully fallen. But by then, the frost had already taken root in every hall. They locked not to keep danger out, but to keep power in. Word of the king's death was not shouted, it was whispered, passed from sleeve to sleeve, behind fans, inside prayer books. No one dared say it aloud. But the truth was thick in the air. Henry VIII, the Lion of England, had drawn his last breath beneath his own horse, and the realm so long ruled by the weight of his shadow was now headless. That night, every man who held a sword, or a title, or a secret, sat wide-eyed in the dark, calculating, because a dead king is not a memory. He is an opening, inside her private chambers. Anne Boleyn did not sleep. She had not removed her gown since the tilt yard, where she had watched her husband fall and her crown begin to fracture. Her hair was unbound, her belly taut with the weight of the unborn. Her hands pressed to her sides, as if holding herself together. Her ladies whispered prayers. Her sister paced the floor, but Anne remained motionless at the center of it all, her gaze fixed on the flames, not weeping, not blinking. If the king had truly died, then the child inside her was the crown. But that crown had not yet cried. It had not yet breathed. Until then, she was both everything and nothing. Thomas Cromwell had not returned to his home since the fall. He rode through the capital like a phantom in black, commanding guards by name, flinging open doors, forcing ministers from their sleep and their wives' arms to sign their loyalty in ink and sweat. He had the keys to the treasury in one pocket and the Tower writs in the other. But he did not yet have control. He needed time, and time, in a kingdom full of wolves, was something only a madman would lend. By midnight, Cromwell had summoned the Privy Council into a secret chamber deep in the stone heart of the palace. The mood was not mourning, it was a hunt. Every man in the room had once bowed to the same crown. But now their eyes studied each other, like soldiers choosing who to shoot first. Cromwell stood at the head of the table, not with a plan but with a sword. Metaphorical and real. He did not offer condolences. He offered survival. He declared that Queen Anne, who now carried the only legitimate heir, was to be protected at all costs. A regency council would form, and he, of course, would preside until the birth. The chamber hissed with protest. But Cromwell was already issuing orders before they could object. Soldiers were posted outside every door. Letters were sent by torchlight to every corner of the realm. The Queen was not to be touched, questioned, or challenged. Not until the child came. But in the north, the old blood stirred. At his ancestral seat, the Duke of Norfolk stood by his hearth in silence. Reading the sealed letter that had arrived with such haste, it still smelled of the horse that carried it. The king was dead. Cromwell had seized the tower. Anne claimed the regency, and Norfolk, uncle to the queen, enemy to her cause, understood the message between the lines. Act now, or be caged like a beast. He did not roar. He smiled, because this, at last, was war. Within hours, messengers galloped through Yorkshire and Lincolnshire, summoning Catholic loyalists and lords still loyal to Mary. Arms were counted, swords unsheathed. The Duke had no need to bluff. The North was already his. What Cromwell had in bureaucracy, Norfolk had in boots. And boots, when marching south, it made better arguments than paper. But Anne had seen this storm coming. Inside her chambers, she summoned Archbishop Cranmer under the pretense of spiritual counsel. But their conversation had nothing to do with God. With trembling ink, Anne drafted letters in her own hand, appeals to nobles she had once insulted, invitations to ladies she had slighted, promises to men who had sworn to see her burned. Her hands bled from the quill, but her eyes never broke. She sent Cromwell a list, not of allies, but of enemies. Those who had smiled too long, those who had said too little, those who waited for her to fall. And Cromwell, hungry for action, began to cut. Within 3 days, 2 members of the council had been arrested for suspicion of treason. One of them was found dead in his cell before questioning. Anne never asked for details. She knew what the silence meant. But silence was a luxury she could not afford. Inside the palace, the walls grew tighter. Every servant was a spy. Every knock could be a dagger. Her meals were tasted by 3 different women. The nursery was cleaned thrice daily. She no longer took the garden path. She no longer took communion without a witness. Her only peace came in the night, when her ladies finally slept, and she could press her hand against her stomach and whisper, "You must come soon." And still the North moved closer. By the 10th day, Norfolk had amassed 2,000 men. They did not carry banners, but they carried a purpose. They marched not as traitors, but as restorers of order. If Anne birthed a girl, they would call her a fraud. If Anne died in childbirth, they would claim it was divine punishment. And if the child did not survive, then Mary would be queen, and Cromwell would be dragged through the streets by his ankles. But then something unexpected happened. Anne invited the Duke of Suffolk, Charles Brandon, the king's longtime friend, and a man known more for charm than politics, to her chambers. No one knew what they discussed. But the next morning, Suffolk publicly endorsed the regency. Days later, he was named commander of the London Guard. Cromwell had not arranged it. He hadn't needed to. Anne, it seemed, was no longer just surviving. She was beginning to rule. The following week, a fire broke out in the kitchens, a small thing, quickly contained. But Anne took no chances. The head cook was dismissed. 3 maids were arrested. A cupbearer was found weeping in the stables, claiming he'd seen the Virgin Mary weeping blood on the stone floors. The palace, once golden with feasts and lutes, now rang with steel and whispers. And then one night, just before dawn, Anne felt it. A sharp twist, a heat like fire, and a terrible, familiar wetness. Her ladies rushed to her side. Candles were lit, sheets stripped, the midwives summoned, and the entire court began to hold its breath. The moment had come, all across England, from the cathedrals of London to the fog-drenched hills of Durham. The people waited. Some prayed, some plotted, some packed, but none of them slept, because what came next would decide everything. A boy would end the war before it began. A girl would send the kingdom into flames. And the mother, Anne Boleyn, already soaked in shadows and secrets, was about to bleed history into life. The labor began in silence. But it did not stay that way. In the darkness just before dawn, as the moon hung low over the towers of Greenwich, the palace walls began to hum with low, urgent movement. Anne Boleyn had been carried to her birthing chamber by the glow of flickering lanterns, her face pale as porcelain, her jaw clenched not with fear, but with fury, a fury aimed not at the pain that tore through her body, but at the fate that still had not made up its mind. She was not a mother yet. She was not a widow yet. She was not a queen secure in her throne, nor a traitor condemned to fall. She was a vessel, and the country was waiting to see what she would pour into history. The birthing chamber had been prepared for weeks, guarded like a military outpost. Only the most trusted midwives were permitted within its wooden walls, women vetted by Cromwell himself, their families held under careful watch as an unspoken insurance policy. Bishop Cranmer had given the child his blessing before the first contraction, whispering Latin prayers that clung to the rafters like incense. And Anne sweating, swearing, gritting her teeth through wave after wave, knew that this night would not end with her. It would end with a cry, or with a silence so deep. It would drag her to the scaffold. Outside the birthing room, no music played, no bells rang. Courtiers walked barefoot, as if sound itself might break something fragile inside. In a room just down the hall, Cromwell stood alone, pacing before the fire, his hands behind his back, eyes flicking toward the door every few seconds. He had received word just hours before that Norfolk had crossed into Northamptonshire, and that the Archbishop of York had held a secret mass, declaring Princess Mary the rightful heir. Time was running out. If a boy was not born tonight, Cromwell would not see the morning sun. He would be seized, stripped, and probably strung up by the tower walls as a warning to all who thought reform could outlive a king. But there was one thing he understood better than anyone at court: the power of timing. And in that candlelit silence, as the fire snapped softly behind him, he closed his eyes and whispered only one word: now. Anne's scream split the silence. It was not a scream of fear. It was a scream that tore through centuries, that struck like a war drum across the palace. Ladies rushed forward. The chamber doors slammed shut. One midwife fainted. Another vomited into her apron. Anne clung to the arms of her chair, blood already pooling beneath her. Teeth clenched so tightly, her jaw cracked. The child was coming. It was coming too fast, or too slow, or just in time. And then, after hours of tearing and moaning, of whispered prayers and bitten hands and wet linen tossed to the floor, a cry rang out, high-pitched, sharp, alive. A boy. Un son. The infant gasped and let out a second scream. This one louder than the first. His skin was red. His lungs strong. His fists curled into little weapons of destiny. He was placed on linen, embroidered with Tudor roses and golden lions. The room exhaled. One of the midwives dropped to her knees and wept. The others whispered, "Thanks be to God." Again and again, as if trying to convince the heavens not to take the child back. Anne did not faint. She did not weep. She reached forward with bloody hands, took the boy to her chest, and whispered his name before anyone else could speak. "Henry," she said. "Henry the Ninth." It was not a plea. It was a command. By noon that day, the news had crossed London Bridge like wildfire. The king was dead. Yes, but a new king had been born, and though he was wrapped in linen and barely large enough to grasp a thumb, he was male. He was living. He was legitimate. And he had a mother who had just stared death in the eye and told it to wait. The bells of St. Paul's rang before sunset. By twilight, Cromwell had already summoned the first official session of the Regency Council. Orders were issued to halt all military movement. Letters were dispatched under royal seal to every shire, every bishop, every noble. A proclamation went out that very night, by the grace of God, and through the womb of Her Majesty Queen Anne, our sovereign Lord Henry the Ninth has come into the world. It did not mention Henry the Eighth. It did not mourn him. It simply moved forward, as if the past had been washed clean in blood and afterbirth. In the north, the Duke of Norfolk stood before his assembled captains in a candlelit hall and read the proclamation in silence. He did not rage. He did not roar. He lowered the parchment slowly and murmured, "She did it." Then he turned to his advisers and gave them the order they had feared. "We ride to London. We kneel." Within the week, the Duke arrived at court, his boots muddy, his eyes dark, his pride cracked down the center. He bowed low before Anne and the child in her arms. "Your Majesty," he said, and he meant it. She did not smile. She did not acknowledge the past. She simply turned and walked away. The infant king cradled in her arms like a blade forged in fire. The weeks that followed were not peaceful, but they were decisive. Cromwell acted as if he had risen from the grave. His enemy disappeared, were reassigned, were made to swear loyalty while trembling. The court shifted like a tide. Old alliances were drowned. New ones were baptized in wine and paranoia. The Queen Regent Anne Boleyn, the once suspected witch, the woman once destined for the axe, now presided over council meetings with the child at her side. His cries more powerful than any gavel. And the child, he thrived. He did not fall ill. He did not wither. His eyes were alert. His grip strong. His christening was held with all the grandeur of a living dynasty. At the font, Cranmer declared him God's answer to England's question. Foreign ambassadors wrote home in awe. The boy had arrived, and with him, the storm had passed. But not all storms vanish. Some retreat, and gather, and wait. In her private hours, Anne would sit with her daughter Elizabeth and stroke the girl's hair in silence. She would look at the fire, at the shadows that danced across the stone walls. and wonder how many men still plotted in the dark. How many daggers waited behind courtesies. She knew the birth of her son had bought her time, but time, like favor, was always borrowed. Still, for that moment, for that one trembling season of England's history, the child had cried, and the kingdom had fallen silent. No bells of mourning for the old king. No riots for Princess Mary. No swords drawn in rebellion. Only a newborn. And the weight of the world in his breath. She was too young to understand power, but old enough to feel its absence. In the hush of the new royal nursery, Elizabeth Tudor stood beside her governess, staring through the arched window as the carriages came and went, as men bowed with their backs to the stone, and as the world remade itself around someone else's name. She was 3 years old, barely beyond the age of chasing shadows in hallways, but even then, she understood that she had been moved. She had not been pushed or banished or taken, but shifted, as if the floor beneath her had gently tilted to favor the child sleeping in the cradle across the room. Her brother, the king, he was Henry IX, a bundle of royal swaddling and future expectations. The boy who had cried when the kingdom needed a sound. The child who had rescued an empire by simply surviving the night. The walls of the nursery echoed with his tiny wails, and wherever he went, people followed. Not because he was wise or strong, but because he was born in the right moment. Elizabeth had once been the center of those footsteps. Once had her cheek kissed by lords, and her name whispered in court prayers. But now the warmth of the throne moved past her, like sunlight slipping through bars. She was not hated. She was not unloved. She was simply second. Anne Boleyn, Queen Regent of England, had no time for softness. She had buried the flirt who had once danced with kings, burned the seductress the court had once gossiped about, and now stood as something else entirely, a sovereign forged in blood and strategy. Her son was her weapon, her seal, her salvation. Her daughter, Elizabeth, was her shadow, not because she loved her less, but because she had to look forward. Anne had walked the edge of the axe and survived. She would not look back, not even at the little girl who mirrored her eyes and her fire. And so Elizabeth watched from windows. She watched her mother disappear into council meetings, followed by Cromwell and archbishops and noblemen who looked at the child queen as both savior and storm. She watched her half-sister Mary vanish from court, her rooms emptied, her tapestries stripped, her name no longer spoken with reverence, but with cautious silence. She watched the servants bow lower and speak softer around her brother. And sometimes, in the quietest hours before sleep, she would climb onto the window bench and press her fingers to the glass, tracing imaginary crowns in the frost. No one told her that she was no longer a possible queen. No one sat her down and said the words, but she could hear it in the tones of her tutors, feel it in the way her clothes were chosen, in the titles she was given. Princess, they still called her, but it no longer rang with the same brightness. It was a courtesy, a kindness wrapped in velvet, but she could sense the truth. The crown had chosen someone else, and she who had been born to a throne made of defiance and fire would now walk beside it. Never on it. Cromwell, to his credit, never ignored her. He visited the nursery often, bringing her books, puzzle boxes, and once, a tiny globe etched with silver lines, marking the far corners of the world. You must understand the world, he told her, even if you do not rule it. He treated her not as a child, but as a person, and she absorbed his presence like ink to parchment. She learned quickly, more quickly than anyone expected. And though she never said it aloud, she began to listen. To doorways, to conversations, to pauses. She learned the language of power not by wielding it, but by being near enough to hear its breath. Anne never discouraged her daughter's intelligence, but she rarely encouraged it either. Her love was measured, efficient, given in glances and quick touches. She ruled from early morning until the moon hung high, returning to the nursery only to kiss Henry's forehead, to whisper prayers over his sleeping form. Elizabeth received her affection in portions short and sharp, like orders disguised as lullabies. Be strong, her mother would say, brushing back her red hair. Be quiet, and be ready. Ready for what? She never explained. Perhaps even Anne did not know. But Elizabeth understood something her mother never fully did, that power could be learned through absence. That those who stood behind the throne often saw more than those who sat upon it. She began to understand the moods of the court from footsteps in the hallway, the rise and fall of voices behind doors. She recognized who had fallen from favor by the silence surrounding their names. She noticed that Cromwell's shoulders grew more tense when letters arrived from Rome, that the Duke of Norfolk always entered rooms with too many rings on his fingers when he was nervous. She noticed everything. As the months passed, the kingdom settled into its strange new order. Anne and Cromwell continued their purge, sending Mary to marry a Protestant prince in Saxony, an exile disguised as a union. The monasteries fell like towers of dust, their wealth seized, their abbots replaced with headmasters and financiers. The navy expanded, schools multiplied, and in the heart of this machine, Anne ruled with cold precision. She was not loved. She was obeyed. And that, to her, was enough. Henry IX, meanwhile, thrived beneath layers of cloth of gold and carved wooden toys. He was still a child, but his every burp was noted by scribes, every fever tended to by the realm's finest physicians. He was not allowed to cry for long, not allowed to fall. He was polished and praised and protected, a prince of parchment and protocol. And as Elizabeth watched him, sometimes playing with him, sometimes brushing his hair, while nurses looked on, she saw the weight being built around him. She saw the iron forming inside the velvet. And she understood perhaps better than anyone that power like that came with chains, not wings. She began to write. Small letters at first, phrases copied from books, then thoughts of her own. She kept them hidden in a box beneath the nursery tiles. Observations, questions, warnings. She wrote not because she hoped to rule, but because she knew that knowledge had weight. And in a palace where every glance was measured, where every smile could be a blade, words were the safest weapon of all. No one noticed at first. She was just a girl without a claim, a girl without a crown. But in the quiet spaces between council meetings and reforms, in the shadows cast by her mother's rise and her brother's coronation, Elizabeth was watching and learning and waiting, because even a girl without a throne still lived in a kingdom ruled by breath, and one bad winter, one poisoned cup, one misstep on a staircase, and the world could shift again. And this time, she would not be second. The road out of England was cold and grey, and not even the heavy veils could hide the tears. Mary Tudor, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, once the most beloved child of the English court, now sat stiff-backed in a lacquered carriage, surrounded by guards who smiled too tightly, and nuns who whispered too much. She was 20 years old enough to understand what a marriage meant when it came without music. old enough to know what it meant to leave without banners, without fanfare, without a father's blessing. The ink had barely dried on the contract when she was told to pack her things. She had not seen her half-sister Elizabeth in weeks. She had not been allowed to speak to Anne. And as the roads narrowed behind her, each hoofbeat echoing like a judgment, Mary knew with complete and bitter clarity she was being erased. But even as her exile began, her shadow still lingered over England like a slow-moving storm. Mary was not just a princess. She was a symbol, the blood daughter of Catherine of Aragon and the niece of Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor. Mary's very existence was a threat to the fragile Protestant world. Anne and Cromwell were building. In her veins ran the last gasp of old faith, of papal loyalty, of a Europe that had not yet fractured. And though the Regency claimed to send her away for her own protection, the truth was simpler, colder, and more final. She was being married to a Protestant German prince, not for alliance, not for love, but for neutralization. If she bore sons, they would never rule in England. If she rebelled, she would do so in a language no English peasant could understand. She was to be silenced by distance, buried in foreign snow. The man chosen for her was Philip of Hesse, a Lutheran nobleman with a sharp chin and an iron heart. His lands were wealthy, his theology acceptable, his loyalty purchasable. It was Cromwell who had orchestrated the match, pushing it through council in a whirlwind of forged urgency. "It is not exile," he said. "It is opportunity." But even his voice trembled slightly when he said it, because he knew this was not politics, it was provocation. Charles V had already sent 3 letters, each more furious than the last, demanding that his cousin be treated with dignity, that the wedding be halted, that Rome be consulted. Cromwell had ignored them all. He was gambling that the emperor, knee-deep in wars against France and tangled in the mess of the Ottoman front, I would choose silence over steel. And if he was wrong, the Thames would run red. Anne Boleyn did not speak Mary's name in council. She did not offer comment on the match, nor did she attend the wedding. But in private, behind her locked chamber doors, she paced in silence for hours, her eyes dark, her lips bloodless. She knew better than anyone what it meant to be used by men in power. And though she had won the throne by outmaneuvering Mary's mother, she still remembered what it had been like to tremble outside Henry's door, unsure whether she would be summoned for love or for ruin. Now she stood on the other side of the mirror, holding the crown like a weapon, and she knew that Mary, proud, pious, and burning with the memory of her mother, would never forget this humiliation. One day, perhaps, the girl would find her way back, and if she did, Anne vowed silently that she would be ready. The wedding itself was held in Frankfurt. Under gray skies and tight smiles, Mary wore a gown of deep crimson, the color chosen by her new husband's advisors to represent strength and peace, though it looked more like a martyr's robe to the English, who watched from the pews. She spoke her vows in German, her accent stiff, her voice cracking only once when the ring was placed on her finger. The chapel was cold. The windows were fogged. There were no English roses, no royal sigils, no bishop from Canterbury, only strange prayers and a ceremony wrapped in foreign syllables. It was as if she had already been forgotten. But Mary did not crumble. She did not rage. She stood tall, kissed her husband's cheek, and held her head higher than any bride had a right to, because Mary knew something they had forgotten: she was a Tudor. And Tudors, when cast out, do not disappear. They wait. They harden. They turn their exile into myth. And while the English court toasted her vanishing with silent relief, Mary lit a candle in her new home, placed it beside a locket containing her mother's last letter, and whispered, in Latin, "I forgive them nothing." Back in England, Cromwell moved swiftly to seal the rupture. He issued proclamations praising the alliance and spun it as a triumph of diplomacy and religious unity. He ordered preachers to declare that Mary's wedding was a sign of divine favor, proof that the English Reformation was spreading across Europe like fire through dry wheat. Monasteries still loyal to the old order were shuttered overnight. 2 abbots were arrested and hanged for sedition. The Navy's shipbuilders were given gold to accelerate construction. More schools were founded, and through it all, Anne Boleyn's name was etched into every charter, every seal, every new translation of scripture. She was no longer just Queen Regent. She was becoming the architect of a new world. But the cost of that world was not measured in coins or cathedrals. It was measured in silence. The court grew quieter in those months. Jesters were dismissed. Feasts shortened. The royal musicians played softer now, their notes restrained, their lyrics scrubbed clean of any reference to old kings or discarded queens. Even Henry IX, still too young to speak, was surrounded by an atmosphere of caution. Every nursemaid was watched. Every tutor was vetted. No one was allowed to mention the king's sisters, not in song, not in prayer, not even in gossip. It was as if the past were a plague, and only absolute forgetting could keep the infant monarch safe. Elizabeth, of course, noticed. She always noticed. She saw how servants flinched when someone spilled wine near the altar. She saw how Cromwell's hands shook slightly when Anne raised her voice. She heard, late at night, the sound of her mother weeping into a pillow, muffled and restrained, as if grief itself had become a threat. And one afternoon, while playing alone in the library, she discovered a book with the cover torn off inside. A poem written in her grandfather's hand. She read it aloud, quietly, and then carefully tucked the page into her sleeve. She knew, instinctively, that even words now had to be hidden. She was growing not in sunlight, but in shadow, and still, she listened, and learned. Anne, meanwhile, began to suffer the toll of what she had built. Her health grew uneven. Her headaches sharpened. She began to speak to fewer people, retreating more and more behind thick curtains and closed doors. Some said it was exhaustion. Some whispered it was guilt. But the truth was simpler. More human, she was afraid. Not for herself, but for her son, because Mary Tudor was gone. Yes, but not gone forever. And the world had a way of remembering the daughters it tried to erase. There were paintings in every room of the royal palace, portraits of saints, of kings, of queens, now long buried beneath slabs of Latin stone. They hung in silent reverence over the tapestries and polished floors, reminders of a bloodline built on spectacle and sacrifice. And now, among them, a new portrait began to emerge of Anne Boleyn, not as temptress nor queen-in-waiting, but as regent, VIII, architect of a Protestant nation. The artist, handpicked by Cromwell, worked for weeks in a cold gallery lit by overcast light, capturing the curve of her cheek, the narrowed gaze, the hand clutching the scroll of royal ordinances instead of a rose. The crown in the painting did not sit gently. It pressed. It weighed. And yet, beneath the rich tones and flawless brushwork, the silence in the portrait was unmistakable. Anne's mouth was closed, her lips tight, her expression unreadable. It was the look of a woman who had built everything she had by outliving those who wanted her gone and who knew they were not finished with her yet. By the year 1537, Anne Boleyn no longer laughed. The woman who had once tilted her head at court jesters, whose wit had outpaced bishops, who had sent love letters folded like birds, now moved through corridors with measured grace and distant eyes. Her rule, by all measures, was a success. England's treasury overflowed with gold, torn from monasteries. Schools and ships multiplied like spring wheat. And her son, Henry IX, was thriving under the watchful care of a hand-picked council of tutors. But the cost of this kingdom, of this careful and calculated future, was a queen who had no one left to trust. Cromwell remained her closest ally. But even he could feel the walls closing in. He had built the machinery of reform. But the machine had grown teeth. In every corner of court, new men rose, Protestant nobles who owed their lands to Cromwell's confiscations, but who eyed the regent throne with the ambition of wolves raised on victory. Some were quiet reformers. Others were loud revolutionaries. But all of them whispered the same question when the door was shut. When will the boy be old enough to rule alone? The prince was now a toddling shadow behind polished doors, a living sigil of legitimacy and hope. At 3 years old, he could recite his catechism, name the saints no longer worshipped, and sit still through sermons that lasted an hour. He was obedient, intelligent, beautiful, and yet, he was still only a child who belonged to everyone, and no one. He had no memory of the father whose death had rewritten the world. He knew only his mother's cool touch and Cromwell's distant smile. The court, sensing the tide shifting, and began to align itself not around Anne, but around the king to come. And so Anne painted herself into corners. She no longer attended the great feasts. She no longer walked the gardens. Her audience chambers were draped in heavy fabric that muffled sound, and she spoke only to those she summoned. Some said she was unwell. Some said grief had taken root and bloomed. Others whispered that she feared for her life. And though she never confirmed or denied any of it, the truth was far simpler. She understood that power had seasons, and winter was coming. Elizabeth, now 5 years old, began to wander further. She no longer clung to her nurses. She had grown too old for lullabies, too sharp for toys. She began to appear beside doorways, peering in with the solemn eyes of a girl who understood more than she should. Cromwell caught her once, listening outside the chamber where 2 bishops argued over the placement of crucifixes. Instead of scolding her, he asked what she thought. "They fight like men who forget God sees everything," she replied. He did not forget the answer. And yet, even Elizabeth could feel it, that subtle, painted silence settling over her mother like a veil. When she visited Anne's chambers, the queen would smile. But it was a brittle thing. The warmth had been replaced by calculation. She would ask Elizabeth what books she was reading, what prayers she favored, what dreams she remembered. And always, before dismissing her, Anne would say the same words: "Listen more than you speak, and speak only when the silence is heavier than your voice." It was not motherly. It was military. Meanwhile, the world outside the palace continued its slow, quiet burn. In the north, whispers returned of Marian loyalists gathering beneath the banner of the old faith, of villagers still praying to saints beneath moonlight, of abbots holding secret masses in barns and cellars. Cromwell, never one to leave a spark unquenched, sent soldiers not to punish, but to re-educate. Churches were gutted and redressed, altars stripped, Bibles replaced. In villages that once echoed with bells, now only state sermons were allowed to be heard. The Reformation was not a wave, it was a blade, and it was being driven deeper every day. And yet, despite the order, despite the gold and the learning and the iron logic of reform, something began to rot beneath the surface. Anne's body had not fully recovered from childbirth. She often trembled when rising from her chair, her fingers stained with ink and sometimes with blood. Her doctors blamed nerves. Her ladies whispered of poison, but she told no one the truth, that some mornings she woke up unable to feel her hands, and that sometimes her thoughts slipped from her like rain through lace. She wrote letters and forgot she had written them. She repeated prayers she could not remember beginning. She feared sleep. She feared waking more, and so she remained still, wrapped in the silence she had ordered for herself. As if by becoming an unmoving statue, she might avoid the fate that had devoured so many before her. Cromwell knew. He saw it in her eyes. He brought her remedies from the best apothecaries in Europe. He offered her rest, retreat, even retirement. But Anne refused. "If I step down," she said, "they will not wait for me to fall. They will push." And so she stood barely, but defiantly against the rising tide of men who saw the Regency as a page that must soon be turned. The court, sensing her weakness, began to murmur more boldly. The Earl of Hertford, Jane Seymour's brother, a man whose ambition had once been laughed at, now gathered allies with quiet confidence. The young Duke of Suffolk began attending council more regularly, often with veiled challenges disguised as questions. Even Cranmer, once Anne's steadfast ecclesiastical ally, began to suggest that perhaps, as the king approached his 7th birthday, the time had come to consider a gradual shift in authority. But Cromwell still held the sword, and as long as Cromwell stood behind the throne, Anne remained untouchable. Until one night, cold, windless, and black as velvet, when the guards outside his residence were found dead, their throats opened with surgical precision, and Cromwell himself vanished without a sound. No body was found. No ransom was sent. No message left behind. Only silence. The same silence that now hung in the halls of the palace, heavy and waiting to be broken. It began with footsteps that did not arrive. The guards were supposed to change just before the 4th hour, their boots clacking in tandem across the courtyard stones, their breath steaming in the morning cold. But that hour came and passed, and no steps came, no voices, no steel tapping against marble. The silence that fell outside Cromwell's residence was not the absence of movement, it was the presence of something else, something final. By the time the door was forced open, the candles inside had long burned to nubs, and the hearth still glowed with the last embers of a fire that had not been fed since before midnight. 3 bodies lay twisted at the gate, throats cut cleanly. No struggle. No scream. Thomas Cromwell, architect of the New England, master of ink and punishment, was simply gone. Anne did not speak when the news reached her. She stood by the window, pale in the dawn light, her hair unpinned and her hands tight around a rosary she no longer prayed to. She did not ask questions. She did not issue orders. She only closed her eyes for a moment and whispered, "Then it has begun," because she had always known it would. Power was never gifted. It was loaned, and the interest had come due. What followed was not chaos, not yet, but something slower. more insidious. A vacuum. The court did not mourn Cromwell. They studied his absence like a cipher. His allies grew quiet. His enemies came forward with careful smiles and folded hands. Papers began to vanish from his office. Laws he had drafted were questioned again in council. His network, once as wide and invisible as the roots of an old tree, withered in an instant. It was not a rebellion. It was a rearranging, as if the court itself had exhaled. Anne's control began to fracture. She issued proclamations, but they were delayed. She summoned counselors, but they came reluctantly. Her signature, once enough to move fleets and fortune, now had to compete with murmurs behind doors. She no longer had the strength to open. Her headaches worsened. Her hair thinned. Her appetite turned to dust. The physician said she suffered from a humoral imbalance. But Anne knew better. She was not ill. She was unraveling. Power had kept her upright. And now it slipped through her fingers like sand. In the nursery, Henry IX continued to grow. He read Latin before most boys could walk. He recited the names of Protestant martyrs and traced his fingers along the edges of newly printed Bibles. But though his intellect bloomed, so too did his distance. He had learned not to speak unless spoken to, not to trust unless commanded. His affection was reserved for tutors and animals. His mother, when she came to visit, often stood in the doorway and did not approach. Once, she reached out to touch his hair and drew her hand back before contact. He did not notice, and in the corner of every chamber, often silent, always watching, stood Elizabeth. She had not cried when the news of Cromwell's disappearance reached her. She had not asked questions. But that night, alone in her small bed, she wrote a single sentence on a scrap of linen paper and folded it tightly beneath her mattress. The sword is no longer visible. That does not mean it is gone. No one had taught her to think like that. But she had listened. She had watched. And now, at barely 6 years old, she understood what her mother no longer seemed able to say out loud. Someone was moving against them. And they were running out of time. It was the Duke of Norfolk who moved first. He arrived at court with twice his usual guard. Citing safety concerns, he met with counselors privately. His voice never raised, but his eyes sharp as coins. He did not accuse Anne of failure. He did not blame her for Cromwell's death. He simply asked questions. How long must the Queen Regent continue? Now that the boy was nearly 4, would it not be better to begin preparing the child to rule? Slowly, carefully, dangerously. He spoke of transition. Anne summoned him only once. He bowed, as required. But his face held no humility. She stared at him for a long time before speaking. "You came into my life through blood," she said, "and now you seek to end it with silence." Norfolk did not deny it. "I seek only peace," he replied, "and time has made your reign heavy." Anne said nothing, and when he left, she sat alone in her chamber until the candles turned to ash. By spring, the nobles who had once sworn themselves to the Queen now shifted toward her son. His name began to appear first on proclamations. His seal was pressed into documents Anne had not seen. His voice, though still childish, was quoted in sermons and schoolbooks, and the Queen, though still regent by law, found herself slowly erased in practice. One evening, Elizabeth entered her mother's chamber to find her sitting before a mirror. Unmoving, the fire had burned low. The curtains were drawn. Anne's gown was too large for her frame. Her cheekbones stood sharp beneath skin that had once glowed. She looked not like a queen, but like a statue left in the rain too long. "I saw a book today," Elizabeth said gently. "One with your name on the spine." Anne turned slowly. "They will take it from the shelves soon." She replied, "Rewrite it. Or burn it." Elizabeth walked forward and placed a hand on her mother's. "Then I will remember it," she said, and for the first time in months, Anne smiled. But the smile did not last. Because that night, a letter arrived. Anonymous. No seal. No inked name. Just a folded slip of parchment slipped beneath Anne's door. 4 words. "He is not safe." The next morning, Anne ordered Henry moved from his nursery. She doubled the guards. She removed 3 tutors, 1 chamberlain, and the nurse who had attended him since birth. No explanation was given. Only silence. Elizabeth watched it all unfold with wide, unblinking eyes. She did not ask where Henry had been taken. She did not ask why the guards no longer smiled. She simply memorized every face that remained, and every name that disappeared. And somewhere in the corridors of the palace, a new force was rising. One that did not come with banners or swords. One that wore smiles and folded hands. One that spoke softly and waited patiently. A force that knew queens could fade. That boys became men. That history loved the sound of footsteps replacing silence. And so it waited. Just outside the nursery. Right behind the painted door. He began to dream of thunder long before he heard it for the first time. In his sleep, Henry IX king, without a memory of his father. Child, sovereign of a realm written in the blood of abbots and the ink of reformers, saw skies split by fire. Saw horses panicked in fields. Saw a voice call his name through the rain, but never reach him. When he awoke, he did not speak of these dreams. He simply stood at the window in his new guarded chamber, staring at the horizon, as if expecting it to break. He was nearly 5 years old now. His face, once round and soft, had begun to stretch into the thin architecture of his lineage, the Boleyn cheekbones, the Tudor stare. His tutors praised his discipline. He memorized scripture, spoke French with ease, and could recite the names of every bishop in the council. But he was not like other boys. He did not laugh freely. He did not climb or sing or chase dogs in the gardens. He observed. He absorbed. And each time he walked through the palace corridors, lined with faces who bowed too low or not at all, he understood somewhere deep and unspoken that the weight on his small shoulders was not waiting for him to grow into it. It was already pressing down. Anne visited him only in the evenings now. And even then, she did not stay long. She entered the room like a ghost, passing through her own portrait quiet. Elegant, veiled with exhaustion. She asked him what he had learned. She reminded him that his life belonged to something larger than breath. She kissed his forehead and left before the warmth faded. The fire in her eyes had not vanished, but it had dimmed. Not from defeat, but from watching too much for too long. The crown no longer sat on her head. It lingered in the air around her like an obligation too heavy to carry and too dangerous to drop. And so she waited, by the hearth, in her private rooms. Anne Boleyn, Queen Regent of a kingdom that no longer asked her permission, sat beside the flames and listened. She listened to the coughs of courtiers behind closed doors. She listened to the servants whispering of ships being built without her approval. She listened to the way the guards outside her chambers had changed men she did not know. Chosen by hands she had not shaken. She had once ruled with parchment and gaze. Now, she ruled by existing, and even that was being questioned. Norfolk's faction had grown bolder. He no longer cloaked his intentions behind veils of diplomacy. In council, he referred to the boy as His Majesty, not the child. He suggested tutors from noble houses, known for their piety, not Protestant piety, but the old kind, the kind that smelled of incense and Latin. He had not accused Anne of anything, but each time he rose to speak, there was something in his posture that suggested the throne was no longer hers to protect, only to remember. It was then that Elizabeth began to write again. She had kept silent since Cromwell vanished, watching the world with a stillness that unnerved even the most jaded chambermaids. But now, at the age of 7, she began filling pages in a small leather book. Observations, ideas, codes she invented, passages from the Bible rewritten in her own voice. She wrote with a quill too large for her fingers, ink staining her sleeves. But her words were precise. She recorded who came and who left. She noted the shift in her mother's voice. She described the faces of Henry's tutors, and the way one of them always held his hand behind his back. Even when drinking, she did not trust anyone with her thoughts, only the pages, and herself. Anne read one of the pages by accident. She found it tucked inside a book of Psalms left open on the windowsill. A single sentence, written in a child's steady hand. They want the thunder to come before the boy learns how to speak through it. Anne did not cry. She closed the book and pressed it to her chest, because she knew it was true. Outside the palace, and the country was quiet, but too quiet. The people did not riot. They did not rebel, but they had grown restless. The old faith had not died. It had hidden, in kitchens and taverns, in market stalls and alleyways. There were whispers that the Queen had turned the kingdom into a ship with no sail, drifting under godless skies, that the true heir Mary had been sacrificed to a foreign heresy, that the boy king was a puppet, and that Anne's crown was lined with the bones of the saints she had burned. Norfolk heard these whispers and smiled. He visited Henry often now, bearing gifts, carved figurines of lions, wooden swords, scrolls of painted battles. He knelt before the boy with reverence, calling him Your Grace in a tone just loud enough for the servants to hear. Anne saw it for what it was, a courtship, not of her, of the future. So she made a choice. She summoned Henry one evening, without Norfolk, without the tutors, without any of the council present, just mother and son. Firelight, flickering against stone. She placed her hand on his shoulder and looked him in the eyes. There will come a day, she said, when they ask you to forget me. They will dress it in duty. They will wrap it in the cloth of the realm. But it will be forgetting just the same. Henry did not blink. I will remember you, he said. But Anne shook her head. No, she replied. You must do more than that. You must decide which parts of me to remember, and which to burn. Because even at 5 years old, Anne knew he would be forced to choose. She did not see him for 3 days after that. Norfolk blocked her audience, citing the boy's education. Her letters went unanswered. Her servants were reassigned. The palace began to shift again quietly, efficiently, as if a new regime were being installed by sleight of hand. And Anne, once the storm at the center of England's transformation, now found herself watched more than watching. In her chambers, she wrapped her hair in a simple scarf and took no visitors. She sat by the fire. She waited. And in another chamber, down the corridor, Henry dreamed again of thunder, and of his mother standing in it, unmoved. They thought the crown would fall on its own, that it would slip quietly from Anne Boleyn's head like a stone rolling from a cliff worn smooth by time. They expected her hands to weaken, her breath to fade, her name to grow lighter each day, until even the stones of court cease to echo it. But crowns do not fall, not when they have been nailed to a woman's skull by war, by birth, by the sheer force of survival. Anne had not ruled because she was wanted. She had ruled because she would not let go. And in the end, it was that refusal, not her enemies, that decided how history would turn its next page. She left the palace before dawn, in a simple carriage. No crest upon the doors, no trumpets, no proclamation, no weeping servants, just the sound of hooves and wheels creaking through damp stone archways. They said it was for her health. They said she had chosen a quiet retreat in the countryside to rest in forma, to recover. But everyone understood. She was being moved, removed, placed beyond the heart of power, so that it could beat without her shadow upon it. Norfolk had not signed the order. He hadn't needed to. The council had done it with polite nods and stiff pens. Even the bishop's seal trembled only slightly in the wax. She did not argue. She did not weep. She did not beg her son to stop them. She kissed his hand. She placed one hand against his cheek, and she whispered something only he heard. Then she turned, veiled in black, and vanished behind the drapery of her own exit. Elizabeth did not see her mother leave. No one told her the exact hour, but when she entered Anne's chambers later that morning, the fire had already died. The tapestries were folded. The scent of rose oil and ink had been scrubbed from the stone. And on the writing desk, carefully placed as if awaiting her fingers alone, was the leather-bound journal she had kept hidden for nearly 3 years, now unhidden, now returned. As if her mother had always known the day would come when she would need to take up the pen. She did not cry. She sat, and she opened it. The first page had not changed. They want the thunder to come before the boy learns how to speak through it. But on the inside cover, now written in a different hand, her mother's was a single line. Do not wait. Do not blink. They are watching the wrong child. From that moment, Elizabeth Tudor stopped being the girl who listened and became the girl who remembered everything. Every council meeting she was not invited to. Every glance Henry gave his new tutor. Every guard who now wore a different crest upon his breast. She began asking questions. No one expected her to ask about trade routes, about church landholdings, about naval construction. She asked why one of her brother's tutors had been replaced so suddenly, why his Latin texts were no longer translated by Erasmus but by men with no English names. She was careful, always, never too direct, never too bold. But beneath her sleeves, her wrists bore ink stains. She was writing again, not in one book, in several. One she kept beneath the altar of the chapel. One she hid behind a loose stone in the wall near the old nursery. One she wrapped in cloth and buried in the garden, where she had once buried a broken doll no one had ever replaced. Her words were no longer just thoughts. They were strategies. She began to speak with the pages of history as if they could hear her. She wrote of Norfolk's ambitions, not as rumor, but as prediction. She wrote of Henry's distance, of how the council was building a wall of titles and rituals between the boy and anyone who might call him son instead of sovereign. She wrote of her mother, not as queen, but as a storm that refused to end even in absence. And in her own strange way, she began to step into the space Anne had left behind, not by taking it, but by making a new one. Meanwhile, Henry IX grew. At 6 years old, he had the poise of a young emperor and the heart of a boy trapped between two worlds. He missed his mother in ways he could not name. The nurse who replaced her was kind but faceless. The lords who praised him spoke in tongues He barely understood. His hands, once held between hers for warmth, now held scepters and pages of law. He did not cry. He did not fight. He obeyed. But in the dark of night, he would stare out the window and touch the glass, as if remembering something he had never seen. And once, just once, he asked his sister, "Why do they call me king when I have no choice?" Elizabeth did not answer. She only took his hand, and for the first time, she understood that her brother, the boy England, was built around, was not being raised to rule. He was being shaped to be ruled through, and that meant one day, if she wanted to save him, she would have to become the blade they never saw coming. Not to take his crown, but to protect it from the hands that now claimed to serve it. In the years to come, they would call her many things. A bastard, a threat, a scola, a spy. But never again would she be the girl who waited. And never again would she let silence decide who survived. Because even as Anne faded from memory in the eyes of a grateful and forgetful court, her daughter remembered the storm, and she knew it had not passed. It had simply gone quiet, waiting, like her.